Okay, so we're going to go back to accessibility. In the last video, I'd sort of suggested that people see it as this scary thing that they're kind of hesitant to get involved with because it's this extra thing they've got to go spend some time on, because the chances are your website's not accessible, your project's not accessible, and it's scoring badly, but we don't even know how to fix it, or there's kind of loads of rules you're going to have to go away and learn, and it's just too much of a faff and no real gain and so on. And that's kind of a mindset that kind of leads to sites being massively inaccessible. So I thought I'd try and just find some things that are quite easy to build into your regular workflow, which don't involve loads of extra learning, which don't involve having to spend loads of extra time. Just small changes you can make in your day-to-day practices, which will just make your sites more accessible without having to implement a whole bunch of features and libraries. So it's a start. How about look at some of these options? Okay, so here's my 5 I've gone with, and they start about as simple as you can get. The image alt property. So, most of the time when you add an image, some sort of emit thing will autocomplete for you, or whatever tool you're using, and always completes with an alt tag, because they're just saying those two should always go together. And at the point where you're filling out, whether it's a dynamic token that's going in or whatever you're putting in, you might as well just add that in as well. It's not an optional thing. You should just always make sure you've got the alt to go with the image, and it's just helpful even if you're not commonly using screen readers or things that have images disabled. You might often have scenarios where your page is loading slowly or doesn't load with images, and something fails and you just get a box displaying, and you want to just have some idea of what image was meant to be there. It's helpful for you as a developer if you're also a kind of person who's fixated on naming things correctly and making sure everything has correct labels, to make sure everything is easy for developers to use and read. It feels like a similar thing. You're just saying, let's label this content correctly. An image is too generic. The source attribute is going to be kind of vague. Let's just add an official title to this, or a reference to this, so I can always work out, or other developers can work out what it's meant to be. Quite commonly nowadays, people will reference these kind of little CSS hacks you can do, like a image not alt, then set a border on it, and if you drop this into your CSS, you can basically just do your own visual check. So if ever you forget an alt tag on an image, it will starkly wrap the thing. You can also do it for, like, if the HTML tag doesn't have a lang attribute, or if buttons are not used in the correct way or don't have the right attributes on them, you can do this. Some people suggested on this Reddit thread that that's kind of not necessarily the right way, because of you're sort of adding extra CSS to make your page look bad by putting big borders on things. So it's like a debugging tool you're putting into your day-to-day CSS perhaps isn't a great idea. There's also a suggestion that if you have images that you don't have an alt text for, so I don't know, you've got an SVG of just kind of a curly shape which just decorates the page slightly, and you really don't need a screen reader to see this or to understand what it is. You can add like an SR only class to it, which might just hide it so it doesn't display, or you could set an empty alt attribute, or you can even give it like role presentation. I believe you can give it like an ARIA role. So there are specific workarounds for scenarios where it doesn't happen, or where you don't need it, but those are usually quite rare. Usually most images you can give them a general brief description or some sort of label, and let the user decide whether it's kind of relevant for them to know what it is. Number 2, and I mentioned it briefly in the previous video, is about the outline visible, outline focus thing. It's just a kind of inadvertent problem we've got into, where people click on things, and that creates this focus which is built for when you're tabbing through a file, and it kind of just looks clunky in a scenario where you just clicked on something. You don't really need to know that's a focused element, so it doesn't really need this black thing. And quite often I think people have then listed that as a bug, and so the developer has fixed it by adding outline none on the CSS property, and that just means that anyone trying to tab through can't see what the currently selected thing is. So it's just a horrible user practice we've got into. There were all kinds of JS solutions, like little libraries that meant that it would only show if you tabbed to it and not if you clicked it. But this can be done now with CSS. It was a while back, 2018, Leveroo talking about how you can do it with focused not. And I believe this is now pretty widespread. You can use it in your CSS, so you can add a focus visible, which, you know, the focus visible should be when you tab to something, that means it's going to focus, but not. But the button has focus that's not focus visible. So this basically is if you clicked it with a button and it's not been tabbed to, then you can do your outline none, and maybe you could do something soft like a shadow. So now there's a straightforward CSS solution. It's something you could just implement once, or hopefully you just get for free with some sort of toolkit library. And yeah, there's not a large overhead or large amount of work to solve something that's kind of one of the most common nagging issues for accessibility on lots of big websites. Next one is Rems, is just using as a base font size. This comes from the Matuzo .at, which is a very good accessibility website. I'll put a link in the description, but generally the idea is that quite commonly for a font sizing, even if you're using a relative system, you'll put something on the body. So you'll put like font size 18 on the body, and then everything else can be relevant to that. The problem is that if the user goes into their actual preferences, either on the browser or on their system, and they try to set their base font size up, it won't be able to change that on the website, because if you've set a very base setting of pixels, a set, you know, strict absolute pixel unit on the body to say this has to be 18 and whatever, and it means that there's never, it can't scale, it can't work with it, your site is going to have that number. If instead you set something like font size 1125 rem, you can generally build your site quite confidently knowing that most people won't have a strict setting, or they'll have the default, so you can work to like 18, 16, whatever your base is going to be, and then throughout your site you can use a clever Rems system that just works off percentages and means you've got a regular structured font sizing system. But it just means that if users want to scale it up or scale it down, they can do, and your site allows them to. So again, these are things that are not massive overheads, they're just little tweaks you can just introduce to your work that will help people but won't change ultimately how you do your work. The other great one on this Matuzo site is about the media queries that are lesser known, about reduced motion and color schemes. So we generally think about media queries, we think about responsive and about certain widths and how to make content fall back at certain points, but there are also ones for catching user preferences for motion and for colors, which have slight accessibility knock-ons. So there's a prefers reduced motion media query, where a user can specifically say that I don't want animations, perhaps they have some sort of disorientation, or they just don't like that cognitive overload of seeing things jolt and jar, and they would rather just get more of a static website. So this is fine. Most animations are kind of superfluous. There are other things, jumping, sliding, changing color, growing, where you really could easily just go from the set state to the hover state or the active state, and you wouldn't need to do some sort of transition. You might think it improves something, or it might give the site a better visual display. So you can just wrap it in a setting. This is kind of the opposite, this example here, where you're saying if they've set it to reduce, or if they've switched off it, then you can just switch your animation to. But they also suggest there's a much more progressive solution here. If it's a prefers reduced motion, no preference, if they've never set a preference on it, they've not explicitly said I don't want any animation, then go for your life. As long as you've wrapped it in this little tag, then it just means as long as they've not said they don't want animation, I'm going to add all my transitions and animations over here. I'm going to make the page jump and spin. You'll have to tell me if you don't want that. Similarly for dark mode, I mean, it became a trend in recent years because of seemed to come in with custom properties and CSS variables, that everyone wanted to suddenly do a dark version of their site because it didn't involve having to build two CSS files. You could just have variables that tweaked and changed, and you could do lovely effects where someone clicks a button and the whole site just transitions into new colors, and that's quite nice. But generally it would be good if you didn't have to preserve a cookie or a setting for that user now to know what they're in. It'd be good if you just read from their actual base settings. Some people just like the dark mode because it's just the site looks cooler with a black background or whatever, but if you can instead read off the user's actual scheme where they've set in their preferences, say I prefer the dark mode or I prefer the light setting, you're considering people who actually might have vision issues or partial sightedness or something where the color contrast needs to be in a dark setting or light setting. So reading from that makes more sense, and it's less work than having to preserve some user preference. And again, can just be done as a progressive enhancement thing. So you just set whatever your standard is, then wrap it in your media query. If they've explicitly said they want the dark setting, then we'll just invert those colors. And there are probably great ways to optimize that, whether you're using some sort of modular system or CSS and JS or a mix-in or something where you don't have to just litter your whole site with hundreds of these, but you could just make a kind of quick function that will enable wherever you add a setting. You could also just add a quick wrapper to say, oh, here's the dark mode version. Or even you just set some colors at the top somewhere and they have one setting that says, like, if dark mode, they don't then change the variable to this color or something. The final one, and it is the one that generally you seem to see most people getting angry about on the internet, is that buttons are buttons. So it's always about people using anchor tags as buttons and buttons as anchor tags because of most people are working in some sort of JS framework. They've all just got straightforward on-click settings on buttons, so you can make a button do a window location and go somewhere that's basically working as an anchor link. Similarly, you can add an A on it with an on-click event, which makes an event happen, and people kind of feel that the two are interchangeable, which is not the case. It goes back to, again, helping you as a developer and helping other people to understand the code. You can see, what is it meant to do? Is it meant to link somewhere, or is it triggering an event? Is it a button? And sometimes you want to adhere, so even though this one is technically an anchor, because of my styles are all wrapped around buttons, I'm going to have to make this a button, because if I want it to look the same as the buttons next to it, and I don't want to have one to look like a link and the others to look like a button, I want them to all look the same style wise. But you've actually created a problem in that you're just building bad HTML. Just recently started using a Cutty, which is a sort of little Tailwind component library. It's a bit bootstrappy, but what's interesting, most libraries will have something like this, where you can have an A tag and you can just give it the classes of button primary, and it will display exactly the same as the rest. And then I can have an input type button or a button, and regardless of these, because of the styling and the classes and the colors are all going to be done through CSS, this is completely accessible. The labels are clearly defined. The HTML is very readable. You'll be able to work out what type of element they are and what they do, but you don't have to worry about it messing up with your styles. So really, using some sort of competent system like this, so that button can be defined through a class in terms of actually visually how it displays, but the core elements could just be what they're meant to be, and you don't feel somehow hamstrung by the CSS kind of having to dictate what element you choose to use. And generally, frameworks are quite often quite good. They're quite a problem in that they obscure a lot of the design decisions, and they kind of impose a lot on you, and also sometimes there's a big overhead to install, set them up and manage them. Just did a few videos on Tailwind, but so sometimes they've out the box got alt tags and labels and some sort of screen reader settings and fallbacks for things. So those are sometimes quite handy if you're concerned about accessibility at the beginning of a project, and it might be nice to lean on some sort of framework that solves some of those problems for you. Yeah, so that's a simple 5. So maybe all those things are obvious to you. Maybe there's one or two that you kind of want to look into more, but there are lots of things like this that are very quick pickups that you can just go like, okay, I'll just do that going forward. And it just means that if you did that every now and then, you just did a refresher and you picked up a few tips, you'll suddenly find, without having to have gone away and spent a month doing accessibility like your homework, you can just slowly integrate these things in and become better at making good websites. That's all today though. So do share any good accessibility tips in the comments though, because I'm definitely missing lots of them out. I'll do a couple more videos on this theme, but that's all today. Have fun.